In the heart of Calabar, Nigeria, a young lady named Judith lived a seemingly peaceful life. She had married the love of her life, Emeka, a charming young man who had swept her off her feet with his gentle smile and unshakable confidence. Judith had dreams of becoming an entrepreneur and living a life full of adventure, but those dreams were soon eclipsed by one stark reality: pressure. It all began when Judith married into Emeka's family, a traditional and somewhat overbearing household. Her mother-in-law, Mama Ngozi, was a strict woman whose presence could fill a room with both warmth and tension. Mama Ngozi had one particular obsession: grandchildren. Every visit to Judith's home came with the same question: when are we hearing the sound of a baby in this house? Judith, who had only been married for 6 months, found herself squirming under the constant pressure. Emeka, too, had begun to feel the weight of his mother's expectations. He loved his mother dearly, but he also knew that Judith was under immense stress. Still, he didn't quite understand the gravity of the situation, thinking that his mother's persistent comments were nothing more than harmless nagging. One evening, after another round of pointed comments from Mama Ngozi, Judith sat alone in their living room, overwhelmed. Her thoughts raced. Why is this happening to me? Why can't I just enjoy being newly married? Why must I already think about children when I'm not ready? It was then that the idea crept into her mind, a way to finally end the constant questioning. What if I just pretended? The thought seemed crazy at first, but it quickly took root. She didn't know how to explain her reluctance to her mother-in-law, and she certainly didn't want to lose Emeka's love. So, Judith decided to fake it. She would pretend to be pregnant, just long enough for the pressure to let up. She carefully crafted a plan. She would wear baggy clothes, avoid certain foods, and tell people that she was experiencing morning sickness, to keep up the illusion. The first few weeks were a struggle, but as the months went by, the lies became easier to manage. Judith could barely recognize the woman she had become, a prisoner of her own deceit. But the weight of the lie began to feel unbearable. She kept up appearances during family gatherings, always sitting at the center, smiling as Mama Ngozi praised her blooming belly. Judith became anxious with every passing day, fearing that someone would uncover her secret. She knew this lie couldn't go on forever, but for now, it seemed like the only way to keep the peace. Mama Ngozi, however, seemed suspicious. She noticed how Judith's belly never seemed to grow, and how her daughter-in-law was always quick to explain away the inconsistencies. But she didn't confront Judith directly, instead, choosing to silently observe and wait for more signs. Then came the turning point, a church service one Sunday morning. Judith had recently started attending a new church with Emeka, hoping that the new environment would provide some distraction. During the service, a well-known prophet was visiting, and the congregation buzzed with excitement. Judith wasn't particularly spiritual, but Emeka insisted they go for the special service. As the service went on, the prophet called for anyone who had been struggling with a secret to come forward. He spoke about deception, about how it could only bring sorrow, and how God's truth would always come to light. Judith, who had felt uneasy from the moment the service began, was suddenly struck by a cold shiver. Her heart raced. The prophet's gaze swept across the congregation, and to Judith's shock, he paused directly in her direction. "There is a young woman here," he said, "who is carrying a secret. You have been lying about something very important, and the Lord says your deception will be exposed." The room fell silent as Judith's breath caught in her throat. The prophet's next words were even more chilling. "The secret concerns your womb." Judith felt her face flush with heat, her knees weak beneath her. She stared at Emeka, who was sitting beside her, completely unaware of what was happening. The prophecy seemed too accurate to be a coincidence. Mama Ngozi, sitting across the aisle, turned to stare at her with wide eyes. Judith could feel the weight of her gaze, as if her mother-in-law was already aware of what was being revealed. The service ended, but Judith couldn't escape the lingering tension. The prophecy had shaken her to her core. On their way home, Emeka turned to her, his voice soft but insistent. "Judith, tell me the truth. What did the prophet mean? Are you really pregnant?" Judith felt her stomach churn. She opened her mouth to speak but found no words. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, she confessed, "No, Emeka. I'm not pregnant. I've been faking it, for months." Emeka was silent for a long moment, his face unreadable. Judith could barely bring herself to look at him. "Why? Judith. Why would you do that?" he asked, his voice full of hurt and confusion. Judith hung her head, ashamed. She explained everything, the pressure from Mama Ngozi, the constant nagging, and how she felt like she couldn't say no. As she spoke, Emeka's expression softened. He had never realized how much stress Judith had been under. The real bombshell came when they arrived at Emeka's family house for a confrontation. Mama Ngozi was waiting, her eyes gleaming with the sharpness of a woman who had known more than she let on. She sat across from Judith, her stern gaze never wavering. "I knew," Mama Ngozi said, her voice low. "I knew all along that something was off with you. But you didn't need to lie. You should have come to me." Judith was stunned. She had expected anger, but instead, there was a quiet sadness in her mother-in-law's eyes. "Why did you do it, Judith?" Mama Ngozi continued. "I was just worried about you. I wanted to see you become a mother, but I never meant to pressure you this way." Judith looked at her mother-in-law, and for the first time, she saw the weight of her own actions reflected in Mama Ngozi's eyes. The woman who had pushed her so hard to have children was, in her own way, struggling with the same fears and anxieties that Judith had been hiding. It was in that moment that Judith realized the depth of her mistake. She had been running away from her own truth, hiding behind a lie that hurt both herself and the people she loved. The apology she offered Emeka and Mama Ngozi was not just for the deception, but for not trusting them enough to share her fears. The road to forgiveness wasn't easy. There were still moments of awkwardness, of quiet conversations about the future, but slowly, Emeka and Mama Ngozi began to understand. Judith promised herself that she would never again let fear dictate her choices. She would face the future, one step at a time, knowing that true peace could only come from living in the light of truth. Answer: Judith learned a valuable lesson that day in Calabar. No secret, no matter how carefully hidden, could ever remain buried forever. The truth, as painful as it might be, always had a way of finding its way to the surface.